Gee, all this for just a little cold. Well, you know what you're doing. Actually, I had a feeling I'd get a cold in this particular room here. It's a real rheumatism type of room. Putting a lot of gauze on me. Well, I'm interested in what you're doing. Of course, I've been to medical school years in my life. I got a degree at the Sorbonne. See, my family was Serbo-Croatian, and they were exiled, and they had to move to Paris. I hope that's not too scalding. And they moved to Paris to live. My father wrote obituaries for the French periodicals. He was a friend of Picasso too. Yeah, actually, I got 2 degrees at the Sorbonne. One was a regular medical degree. I hope the water's not too hot. Even then, I had a dream of my career and my vision. Ah, yes. But really, you know, I've spoken to the girls about my dream of doing these operations, but actually what I ultimately envision is not simply changing, but exchanging. For instance, doing a duplex operation. Now, by that I mean, what are you going to do with that? Very interesting. By that I mean having 2 people at the same time and exchanging the organs. Transplanting the organs. Speaking of organs, I studied both science and organ playing with the famous great doctor, humanitarian, great playboy of the Western world, Dr. Alvin Chicago. Actually, all his students, we adored him. We used to sit at his feet and comb his mustache. That's why I have a mustache today, out of my reverence and devotion for the great Dr. Chicago. And all of us students there who were devoted to him and studied with him, we were called small Chicagoites. Why, there was a boy from Tanganyika, I think it was, black fellow. Was going to go home to his tribe to become a witch doctor. We used to refer to him as the ferocious. Wonder what's become of him. Tall fellow, very tall. I remember he used to stand at the window and look out into the streetcars and beat his tom-tom alone in his room. They say Paris is the melting pot, but I know a lot of lonely little Chicagoites. Albert, I call him Albert now because I have my degree, and he always wanted us to, as soon as we got our degrees from the Sorbonne, to treat him as an equal, but of course that's impossible. He used to, during our operations, doing transplants of the femoral artery, I remember, would discuss Bach, and he used to say how the fugues of Bach were like the lower. He used to say that the fugues of Bach to him were like the lower intestine. They wound around. It was amusing. He always had interesting parables to tell us. They wound around and went through various channels and came back to the same place. And it was an apt analogy, I'll say that. I've never forgotten that. Every time I hear a fugue of Bach, I think of Dr. Schweitzer's lower intestine. He used to make things beautiful to us. I remember during operations, if one of the students would feel queasy, his great original line was, "Gentlemen, my little Schweitzers, if you're going to faint, faint forwards." He was a wonderful man. I won't ever forget that. Why, if I had a cabin like this, I would have a mechanical organ put in so that I too could play the fugues of Bach. He used to distinguish between the fugues of Bach and the fugues of George Friedrich Handel. He said that the fugues of George Friedrich Handel couldn't hold a candle to those of Bach. And he said those of Bach, you should never look back on Bach. This is very interesting. Do you have a large practice here? Do you have many patients among the woodland animals, both lowland and upland? I remember studying that there were the lowland animals and the upland animals. Like the Dutch, there's the lowland Dutch and the highland Dutch. In Scotland, of course, there's the highland Scots and the lowland Scots. All this for just a little cold. Well, I suppose you know what you're doing. Of course, in my profession, we would probably, if someone came to us with a cold, I would suggest a kidney transplant. Because I am a firm believer that colds originate in organs, and once they get in an organ, they stay in the organ. There's no removing a cold from an organ, particularly the lower organs in the back. The only real way to cure a cold is, from my point of view, and after all I'm a graduate of the Sorbonne, is to remove the organ and replace it with someone else's who's never had a cold in their life. Now, you know and I know there are people that have never had a sick day in their lives. My grandfather was like that, bless his soul. Oh yes, my grandfather. I remember him well. His name was Annie Arbor. He was a musician, you know, but he didn't compose very much. He talked about it a lot. Oh, he used to tell me when I was a little chap on his knee. He used to say, "Alvin, there's the uptown school and there's the downtown school. If you decide to be uptown, you can't very well go downtown. And if you're downtown, there's not very much chance that you'll ever get uptown." And I said, "Well, Annie, where do you stand, uptown or downtown?" He said, "Well, I'm in the middle of the town." I remember that so well. It's always been my philosophy as a surgeon. If there's a question whether to operate on the upper intestine or the lower intestine, I usually decide on the middle intestine. And I've never been wrong so far.